Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You know, this is going to be one of the more contentious subjects. I read in the social media that we apparently have an emergency in India. I'm not quite sure whether I can feel it or not, but nevertheless, I think over the past 2 years, periodically and very seasonally, we've been told about how the space for dissent is being systematically truncated in this country. And it is a refrain which has a very wide circulation, if not in India, certainly overseas, where if you repeat a message unendingly, it becomes almost a home truth. The question, therefore, which we have to address is if disagreement is part of Indian life, it's part of any life, even within political parties there are disagreements, what exactly is dissent as different from disagreement? Why is it that people who are sort of professional dissenters, as it were, are honored with prizes, while people who disagree are basically told, shut up? So there is something fascinating and there is an aura around this term dissent. Now I looked up the dictionary just in case I missed out something, and it said dissent is those, or dissent happens to be when there is a perspective which disagrees from the majority opinion. Now, I think that's a very narrow definition. I think we could extend it, and Vivek here has prompted me and said, when we disagree with the establishment, which again is a very problematic term. What exactly is the establishment? Is it a fixed term? Does it change? Does it change every 5 years? Is there a new establishment? Is there an ancien regime? Then we have a question of, I use the term from an eminent British philosopher, Roger Scruton, who uses the term common decencies. If we deviate from what is called common decencies, we'll be a minusculity, but we'll be a dissenter. Then we have very celebrated dissidents. Alexander Solzhenitsyn comes to my mind as a person who, and Andrei Sakharov in the days when I was growing up, as people who very bravely were dissidents against the Soviet Union, and some of them were rewarded with Nobel Prizes as well. So it is not that Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov were saying anything which was against the common decencies of the people of the Soviet Union. It was that they were different from what the state. So is the state going to be the arbiter of what is a dissident and what constitutes acceptable opinion? Yesterday, there was a High Court ruling in London on the Brexit issue. And I was looking at the tabloid headlines, which my friend Patrick French brought to my notice very disapprovingly, I might add. And the headline in the Daily Mail was, they had the pictures of the judges, and they said, enemies of the people. Now, imagine, tomorrow the Supreme Court gives a silly ruling, and we decide enemies of the people. In India, it would be contempt of court. But it's not probably going to be contempt of court in the UK. Many years ago, in a similar sort of judgment, I think another tabloid had a thing about, they had the pictures of the judges and they said, 10 old fools. And the case was brought to, I think, Lord Denning. And he ruled, he said, well, 10 is indisputable, because that's the number of judges who are there. Old, that's undeniable. And fool, well, that's a matter of opinion. So So he dismissed that. I doubt if our Supreme Court will be so indulgent in this matter. Is that necessarily a reflection of the fact that what is the space for dissent? The answer to that, therefore, is that every society necessarily draws its own boundaries as to what constitutes legitimate and what constitutes illegitimate. The term blasphemy is rarely used in India very much, partly because we are not very attuned to theological discussions. But blasphemy was one of the most common features in which dissenters were actually separated in the West. Burning at stake as witches, executed, garroted, all forms of hideous punishments were devised mainly for dissidents, and they were religious dissidents. I understand there may be some parts of the world where this practice still continues, but we'll put a gloss over that. Now, therefore, the question arises in India, what constitutes dissidence? Yesterday, Amit Shah ji spoke that it's all right to disagree. The disagreement with the government of the day is legitimate, whereas disagreement or violation or an offense against India is indefensible. So he just drew a line between what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. Now, the question really arises, how much leeway do we give? And that's, to my mind, it's one of those very touchy and problematic issues in this country. Yesterday, the Chief Minister of West Bengal got all indignant that one channel had been banned or taken off the airwaves for 24 hours. She thought it was terrible. Some people again compared it to the emergency. Emergency, of course, has become a shorthand when you don't like anything, emergency. But the same Chief Minister threw a gentleman into jail for publishing a cartoon. So the question again is, freedom is what suits me. Dissent, an unacceptable dissent is what doesn't suit me. That can be a very arbitrary form of thing. And this comes in constantly over the thing as to exactly how much we allow ourselves. And we get back to this whole thing about common decencies. And common decencies, again, vary from country to country, from society to society. What constitutes common decencies in India may seem rather rigid in terms of the Western ideals of what it could be. We, for instance, did not think, and I believe quite rightly, that the publication of the Danish cartoons, the gratuitous publication of the Danish cartoons was something legitimate, and I'm very glad that people in India did not print it. Because it was a willful, quite deliberate affront to people who thought it was offensive. Now, if I was to celebrate the publication per se as an instrument of the right of free speech, as they did in France, would I be right? Within the French discourse, it meant something in French values. But in terms of the Indian values, it did not mean anything. So it's very, very important to be specific in our idea as to what. And therefore, it's really, and that too is again unchanging. Every movement, for example, in India, even Mahatma Gandhi's movement, had people who disagreed totally with them. Bhagat Singh was a person. Was he a dissenter? He was a dissenter in terms of the Gandhian rhetoric. Savarkar, he was a dissenter. These were dissenters. But yesterday's dissent sometimes becomes tomorrow's conventional wisdom. That has happened periodically over the thing. So I think when talking about this subject, we have to be a little cautious. Firstly, there are certain freedoms which are broadly sacrosanct in this country. And we must be very clear what these freedoms are. We must also be clear that there are defining limits. And that is enshrined in the Constitution per se. But again, Constitution, how we interpret the Constitution is a matter of subjective opinion. It's not absolute, but what is the defining norm? So it is through a constant engagement with people, ability to draw in more and more people into society. Today's stone thrower, Sajjad is here, he's probably experienced this bout of stone throwing. That's unacceptable in today's circumstances because of the manner of which the protest. But it's quite possible, entirely conceivable, as happened in Mizoram, as happened in Nagaland, that tomorrow those very same people will be accommodated and incorporated within our mainstream discourse. So to shut the door completely while making your point clear and labeling them permanently as dissenters and celebrating them with prizes at The Hague, while it makes good sense to some people, to my mind, within the context of India, doesn't make very sense. Now, each one of these people, this celebrated, this very interesting panel, have their own take on what they see as dissent. They have their different experiences. I have only shared some very larger theoretical overviews on the subject. Atish has his own experience, Ashok has his, Shekhar has been tweeting furiously about the emergency in the past 2 days. Rupa Ganguly has waged resolute battles against the left. Vivek has seen an insidious form of censorship which says that his films are illegitimate. So each of them have their thing. And I think what you will get out of this entire discussion is that when we approach this question, keep in mind 2 things, that freedoms are sacrosanct. There is a limit to freedom, which we have to, in our own minds, be clear about. And thirdly, that just because someone is called a dissenter doesn't mean that person automatically becomes an exalted hero. Thank you very much.